So yesterday we had the opportunity off camera to finish driving those ground posts and to get a bunch of these bows up. So I wanted you to see that back here we started with the end bow that was farthest from where we assembled the bows so that we could bring them back across the empty field and start setting them up in sequence from the back to the front. We were able to get most of these up yesterday, but we're going to show you today how that worked. So when we start to assemble these bows, it's important to remember that the bows that go on the ends of the house are a little different in configuration than the ones that go in the middle of the house. So this is an end bow laid out here, not yet assembled. And this manufacturer, Rimmel Greenhouse Systems, actually paints the ends of their end bows. So that's one way we can tell. But this is the really important way here. If we look all along this bow, we see these holes drilled. And that's because the purlins at the ends are actually going to be bolted right through the bow, whereas we're going to use a clamp on those intermediate bows. So we just want to make sure we're not using end bows in the middle of the house, because then you won't have them when you need them. Assembling an end bow, there are only two of these. Guess where they are? They're on the ends. As always, those bolts are going from the outside to the inside so they don't tear the poly.
That's the last two bows, right, that we're going to film?
So now we're laying out an intermediate bow, and you can see on this one there's no paint on the end and no holes along here for the purlins. There is still a hole up here for the ridge piece, which you'll see in a moment how that all goes together. So these are the components to the ridge connector, which are used to connect the bow on the right-hand side to the bow on the left-hand side. These need to be assembled thusly. It's always important with these carriage bolts. All of these carriage bolts, of course, this is going to be the outside of the house. We want to come from the outside to the inside of the house. That way, when this is up in the air, and this will be the very tippity top of the greenhouse, that poly isn't riding on the end of that bolt. Put this on finger tight, and we'll do the same on this side. And we leave that finger tight so that when we come in to assemble the bows, we've got a little bit of play when we have to hit that next one. On any of these carriage bolts, we're going to torque down the nut using a deep socket just until that head pulls in flush to the metal. We don't want to go much further than that and strip it out or break it. So that'll look something like this. That first mark is blue. That indicates that a purlin is going to go there. We haven't talked about purlins yet, but they're the bars that run along the length of the greenhouse. The next mark is green. Green is going to be the bottom of that truss support. And so the brace band for the truss support will go right on that green. As we move up, the next blue is another purlin mark, and then the red will be the top of the truss brace. Those bolts are going from the outside to the inside so that the smooth part's touching the plastic. So now we're inserting the ridge connector. Use a brace band to secure the truss support, and that's done at that red mark. The blue mark comes into play later with purlin, so we'll ignore that for now. The brace bands were already installed on the truss support. Measured out at 6 feet from the bow. Different manufacturers have different attachment systems. This particular one uses a splice that goes inside the ground post and gets bolted through. When we install the bows, they'll slip down over this splice and get bolted through here. I'm going to leave this one just finger tight, a little bit loose here, and that might help us to find that hole when we're installing the top bow. So we're going to put some wind braces on all four corners of these houses, and they'll go on the first, second, and third bows in. And Chris has got a real trick here to make getting those band clamps on a lot easier. Before we put the bow on, he's going to set the band clamps down onto the posts, and then we'll be able to slide them up to the appropriate location and secure those wind braces. I'm gonna let him get his. Sometimes if they stick a little bit, you actually want to give a little bit of a push that way. Keep your fingers clear from this joint because this can come down really fast. We'll install the bolt from the outside through. If it doesn't fit, which it looks like it might not here, sometimes we can use a drift pin or a punch to try to line those holes up, or we might even have to drill it out. We don't want to mess up the threads when we're pushing this through. And that one isn't quite lining up on the inside, so I'm actually gonna drill it just a little bit. Driving these are 1/2-inch nuts. We use a deep socket so that as the bolt starts to protrude through, it doesn't run the nut out of the socket. So I'm using a deep socket on an impact driver. But of course, you certainly can still do these the old-fashioned way with a combination wrench. So remember, our end bows don't have the trusses on them, so as a result, this one's going to be a little floppier when we carry it up, so we just want to make sure we're really stabilizing it. It also means it's lighter. So the trusses we've already looked at, those distribute downward force on the house out to the bows and down to the ground. Purlins are pipes that run along the length of the entire house, and they secure each bow to its neighbor, and they help to distribute forces in that other direction. This house has 2 purlins on each side and one at the very top. The one at the top we call the ridge purlin, and the ridge purlin is the only one that's drilled for every bow, as we see here. And we'll install that and see that we bolt this to every bow. The side purlins we'll look at in a moment, they won't have these holes intermediate, but some of them do have a hole on the end. The ends of these purlins are swaged, where they're actually compressed down at the fabrication shop. And that allows us to take an unswaged end and slide it right over. And we already saw in truss construction, and you'll see later on, we'll actually secure these with a self-tapping screw. The very first piece of ridge purlin we're going to put up is the one piece that is not swaged on either end. On the ridge pole, check your manufacturer's directions. But for this one, we're going to set it on the top on each bow except the one on the end, which will go underneath. And this will help so that the ridge pole doesn't tear the poly. As always, those carriage bolts are going from the outside to the inside. Just tighten this finger tight from now on until we get to the other end. The ridge pole will be on top of the house, and we can see that's already starting to make these bows a little more rigid. So now, before we reposition those ladders, we'll tighten these down. We'll reposition the ladders, move on down the house. So now the only thing we need to watch for is that the swaged end is forward, and we're going to have to get this up into position and Chris and I will need to push that swaged end into the cut unswaged end of the piece we just put up. Get those holes lined up the best I can and push that swaged end in. Now this bolt has to line up both the first ridge pole we put up and the swaged end we just put together, and then of course the bow itself. Again, we'll put that on loosely so we have plenty of wiggle room. Bring this bow back into position. And continue to work your way down the house that way till we get to the end when we need that final end piece. On this last piece of ridge purlin, this is a 96-foot house, and so it works out that it's the same length as all the others. But on a shorter or a longer house, this last piece will have a different length. So when we're laying them out ahead of time, we want to make sure that the swages are always pointed in the right direction. Remember that that first piece has no swages on it, and then this last piece will have a swage, but will be shorter than the rest of the pieces. On this greenhouse, with this manufacturer's recommendations, we bring the ridge underneath the end bow, although it's been above all the rest. Now that the ridge purlin is secured, take a moment to confirm that all the connectors on all the bows are torqued down. If you've not yet tightened the bolts holding the bows and trusses together, do that now. So we've laid out our side purlins, and these are really similar to the ridge purlin, except there are no intermediate holes drilled because they're going to be held on with a clamp. There is a hole drilled at the end, and so the two end pieces can be a little bit different. You'll notice we start on this end piece with a hole on that end and a non-swaged end over here, just like on that ridge pole. Then the next that we've laid out has swaged on the front end, no holes, and non-swaged on the back. And that carries on for each of the intermediate pieces. And then that last piece, just like on the ridge pole, depending on the length of the house, may be a different length. So that last piece will start with a swage, come down the given length, which varies based on the house, and we'll have a hole in the end of it for the last bow. So make sure you've got those specialized end pieces set out in the correct location with all the swages pointing in the same direction. So these side purlins, this house has 4 of them. We want to start at the upper ones, work our way down. There are blue marks on the intermediate posts where these purlins will be clamped in. The end posts, remember, they're bolted in. This is the same bolt that we used on the ridge purlin, and we'll lift this into place. The bolt, of course, comes through the hole. This is, remember, why we had those end bows pre-drilled. Do that and leave that a little bit loose. So this greenhouse comes with a wooden spacer that Kyle's holding for us here, and it's notched out just to hold the 2 bows at the proper distance, because these purlins are going to do a lot to maintain the distance between the bows to keep them from moving toward or away from each other. So while we're installing them, we want to make sure that we have a consistent 4-inch spacing between them. As Kyle holds that spacing jig, Chris is going to install the 2-part clamp using 2 carriage bolts. He has that purlin lined up with the blue mark. And he tightens those clamps enough that that bow can't slide on that purlin. And then we'll move the ladders back and repeat all the way down the house. So this last purlin, remember, is going to be swaged on the the initial end, and on this back side we have a hole drilled and it's not swaged back here. The length on this one may be different than the length on all the segments coming up to this point. The intermediate purlins, as we've seen, get bolted in on the end bows, but on the intermediate bows, some manufacturers will bolt them in, some use a different type of clamp. This particular one uses this two-piece clamp. So we put these bolts in, again making sure that the end of the bolt is facing away from the poly. And we're going to tighten these just snug enough to hold the purlin in place so that we can't slide it. That's what those clamps should look like before we torque them down after we've installed all of them on the line. Whenever we swage two of these purlins or ridge connectors together, we want to make sure that we secure that junction with two self-drilling screws. And a self-drilling screw has a little bit of a chisel point at the end. This particular one is driven with a 5/16 inch driver. And I prefer to use a drill with this rather than an impact driver to help prevent over torquing it. So I've set my clutch such that hopefully it'll drive it but not over torque and snap the head off. And we start spinning it, and then once it begins to cut its way in, we can give it a little more speed and a little more pressure, and eventually it'll drill itself right into that metal. We do 2 per joint, making sure we hit the swaged end on the inside. Make sure that all the swaged connections are secured with 2 self-drilling screws. Do this at all the truss supports and purlins. This board is going to be our baseboard. The baseboard goes along the bottom of the house at the ground, and it's where our roll-up side will come down to, and it helps to keep cold air from coming in on the edges, etc. We'll show installation in a moment. Most lumber comes in some increment of 4 feet. So whether that's 8 foot or 12 foot or 16, we see this is actually 16 foot 2 locally sourced rough cut lumber. Problem with that is that our bows on our greenhouse are also 4 feet apart. We don't want to have the ends of the baseboard lining up with a bow. We want the end of the baseboard to be between bows, and then we'll splice it together with a piece. So we're actually going to cut this one down to 14 foot, which will put it in between 2 of the bows, which is not a multiple of 4 feet. So I'm going to mark here at 14. And now when we go to put this on the outside of the house at the bottom, this piece that we cut off will actually make a nice splice piece to join into the next one. And I want to talk too about lumber. Of course, this wood is going to be in contact with the ground, which leads, rather rapidly to decay. A lot of greenhouses will use a pressure-treated lumber. This particular application, the produce is being grown in the soil, and the produce is certified organic. And under the National Organic Protocol, we can't use pressure-treated lumber in contact with soil that's growing plants. And so this farmer has opted to use this natural, locally sourced rough sawn lumber, and the reality is it'll have to be replaced in time as it rots.
Because there's a slight pitch to the grade of the land on where we're putting this house, in order to keep the baseboard from being too high off the ground on the far end, we're digging a small trench and setting this end into the ground a few inches, probably about half the width of the baseboard. And then we're going to run that baseboard level across to the far end of the house and it'll be a few inches off the ground, but only a few inches to fill in underneath it on that far side. When you're happy with the depth of your trench and it'll accept your baseboard, then lay your baseboard in place. We drew a line, not drew a line, but stretched a line across the post to indicate where the top of our board is going to fall. This is a Rimmel house, and they recommend bolting your baseboard to the end bows. So we're going to drill a hole for that bolt next. We're going to use a 4-inch bolt, carriage bolt, for that attachment. Okay, we attach the baseboard to the ground posts in the intermediate ground posts with this 2-inch pipe strap. This gets placed around the ground post, and then these 1.5-inch wood screws are used with hex heads, are used to attach the pipe strap and pull the baseboard into and attach it to the ground post. Also get attached to the ground posts with a Tech screw or a self-tapping screw. And we'll continue that right on down all the intermediate posts. And then when we get to the end bow, we'll drill a hole again to accept the 4-inch carriage bolt and bolt the last part of the baseboard to that end bow. At the splices for the baseboards, we use a small cut-off piece of wood to splice the two baseboards together. 3-inch screws from the inside wood screws. We want at least 4 wood screws on each side of the splice. A C-clamp can be used to pull the boards together if they're springing apart a little bit. And that's all there is to it. You'll want to create a splice like this wherever 2 of the baseboards butt together.
Wind bracing is used to transfer energy from when the wind hits the end wall and gets pushed back. It transfers that energy down toward the ground posts. And it's going to fit right in here using these band braces. Now hopefully you put yours on already before we assembled the bows, but if not, you can pull these apart a little bit and snap them on. The brace components go between the bows. Of course, the bolt goes from the outside in. Do these finger tight. Follow the manufacturer's directions, but these wind braces span across 3 bows. Simply position the top one directly above the lower one. And when you're comfortable with the position of those, torque those bolts down and torque those nuts down and repeat on all 4 corners. This site has a high wind load, so the manufacturer specified additional wind bracing at the ridge. These are installed now. At this point, check to make sure that the end bows are plumb, straight up and down. This will be important for later when we build the end walls on these bows. Get the tolerance from the manufacturer for how far out of plumb these can be. If they're outside of that tolerance, you might need to rack the end bows at this point by applying a force in the direction that you need them to move. This is a piece of double wire lock channel, and this is going to be installed next along the entire length of the house on both sides. This is going to hold the poly both for the roof and for the roll-up side, and we'll show you later how that works. Because this comes in 12-foot lengths, if I installed it starting at the front of the house, it would end up directly over a bow. And so instead I want it to end up between two bows. We'll see why in a minute. So I'm going to cut this down from 12 feet to 6 feet so that it ends between two different bows. I have a reciprocating saw with a metal blade. This is aluminum, so we want to, if we do too much too fast, we can actually melt aluminum onto those teeth and they don't work as well anymore. And now we have two 6-foot sections. One will start the right side of the house and one will start the left side of the house. So this double wire lock channel is going to get affixed to the outside of the house to hold the poly coming over the top and for the roll-up side. This material is recessed to hold these hex head bolts. And so we want to get them slid in ahead of time. And then when this goes into position, the 2-ear clamp goes around the pipe, and then we'll lift up the channel into position and bolt it on like that. But we have to get those bolts into place first. Now this material is going to go 30 inches up from the top of the ground post. So Chris will measure 30 inches up. And then rather than having this material come all the way out on this bow, we're actually going to use a little T-plate so that the material can be supported out here, and that'll allow our attachment system on the end bow to go up more easily over this T. So we'll attach this T now using self-drilling screws. We talked before about how to install these self-drilling screws, but I didn't mention it's really important that we have eye protection on when we do these. They do make a lot of little metal shards that come out from the tip of those screws as they drill themselves in. Some folks will use a small drill bit and make a pilot hole. If it's dancing around too much on you, that might be helpful. Remember, the trick here is we start slow with some pressure, and then as we start to bite that metal, then we can increase the pressure. Now, using the bolt that we've already got in that channel, put that bolt through, and we'll bring the double wire lock just back to the beginning of that T and put a nut on that side. These bolts that we put in ahead of time. Very nice. And we've got that lined up. Chris is going to measure off another 30 inches to the center. And use one more self-drilling screw to attach the band to the pipe so it doesn't slip down or up. And we'll start to install the next piece the same way, and I'll show you how we splice up between the two in the middle. I'll slide this down so these just butt together. Excellent. Great, we got it. So at the splice, we're going to use our splice plate, position it over the middle, clamp it down. Now we'll go to the outside of the house, and using 4 self-drilling screws, we'll attach to the splice plate. Continue on down the house, and when we reach the end, the 12-foot piece should fit exactly to the inside of the T that you'll install on the other end, pointed in this direction. Now we'll install the wire lock channel that's going to hold the polyethylene sheet in place at the ends. This material has a single channel, unlike the double channel used at the hip board. Some manufacturers may supply a specialized piece of channel that comes around the front of the bow to hold the top of the polycarbonate panels on the end walls. Starting at the peak of the house, we secure this channel using self-drilling screws. The channel will simply be bent over the peak, so start in the middle of the piece of channel so the end doesn't pop up like a spring. Bend it right over. Have some clamps on hand to secure it as you screw it in. Use 2 screws closely spaced at the end of each channel and continue on down the bow. Clamp down as necessary. Measure and cut pieces to fit as needed. And file down the rough edges, both for your safety and to protect the poly. Finished installation should look like this. In a later video, we'll string the anti-billow rope. This prevents the roll-up sides from lifting up in the wind, but now we need to install the eyelets for that rope. The roll-up pipe needs to be parallel to the baseboard and the hip board, not necessarily level to the ground, so we can simply measure down a set distance from the top of the baseboard. Using a nut, set the depth of the eyelet to allow enough eye bolt to protrude to hold the roll-up pipe. Install a washer. These eyelets are going to go through the baseboard just beyond the post, and the rope is going to go up to the hip board using a specialized attachment piece called a rope clip just beyond the next post. The rope will then come down to another eyelet just beyond the next post. Measure the location for the eyelet in the middle of the baseboard, a couple of inches beyond the post. Do this for every other post, keeping the same distance from the top of the baseboard for each eyelet. Drill a hole at each mark and install an eye bolt assembled with washer and nut on the outside and inside, and then secure it. Repeat for the length of the house on both sides. If you like, you can make a quick jig to make setting the nuts on each of these eye bolts easier and more uniform.